So the thing I want to talk about this morning is the fact that this nation has sold our children into slavery. I'm talking about the slavery that we have created by this debt system that operates, especially in this country, but frankly all across the world. Now, it's recently been reported that the student loan bill that is due for the youth and frankly some of the parents in this country exceeds $1 trillion. $1 trillion is the estimated student loan debt held in this nation. Now, the thing I want people to understand is that number 1 trillion is an absolutely unimaginable and an unbelievable number. $1 trillion spread across the youth that should be coming out and being productive members of a society, generating wealth, buying homes, buying cars, and contributing to the prosperity of this nation. But as they are saddled with that kind of debt, it becomes absolutely impossible for them to move forward because they are, in fact, buried underneath this debt. Now, I want to talk about the fact that when I went to law school, I took out student loan debt. It was relatively manageable, but it was small in comparison to the debt that's being heaped on the student today. I saw a figure that student loan debt has increased 750%. Now, a lawyer in my office made the point that, mathematics has not changed in a couple of years. 1 plus 1 equaled 2 300 years ago, and it still equals 2 today. And yet, every single year, textbooks and other things are required to be purchased by students to incorporate in the latest and the greatest. As we understand it, it's truly not the case that we don't need all these new textbooks and we don't need the hundreds and thousands of dollars that are heaped upon as a result of that. But students are forced to buy additional textbooks and incur additional debt, not because it contributes anything to the educational experience, but because it's a profit center for all the corporate vipers that are now involved in the university and education system. Now, the very same factors that are involved in the collapse of the housing market and our financial systems are at play with student loan debt, but it's even more pernicious. And the reason for that is, again, the basics of education have not changed. The university system and the education system have not changed all of that much. And frankly, the economics of fundamental education have not changed. But what has changed quite dramatically are the financing incentives that exist within basically all of higher education, but especially in the private university systems. The bricks and mortar have not changed demonstrably, although we have seen some phenomenal increases in bricks and mortar, the buildings and that sort of thing, but that's not a dramatic change. The real dramatic change that exists in higher education financing is, in fact, with the financing. The principal amount of loans for students has increased dramatically, and that's bad enough. But heaped on top of the principal amount of loans that has increased dramatically is the financing on the back end of that. So we have a student that takes out a student loan of $50,000, say, and the interest upon that begins to accrue immediately, and that becomes a greater and greater burden for that student. But that's bad enough. What we need to talk about is the fact that once that student loan principal is established, that debt is sold off to the same securitization forces that collapse the financing market. So if you have a $100,000 principal loan that's accruing interest at, say, 6% a year, that payments is sold off to the securitization vipers that sell, in turn, those investments to investors. Now, again, what becomes so pernicious about this is the fact that that interest continues to accrue and accumulate, and the principal is very hard to reduce down, even in a good employment environment. But what we understand has happened in this country is our economic and employment base has been decimated by the policies of the elected officials in Washington, D.C. and all across this country who, in fact, are working for the corporation. So when that student took out that student loan debt, assuming that when he or she got out, there were going to be jobs on the other end to pay that student loan debt, that contract was broken. And I think that's one thing to keep in mind here, is that there was a very real contract that was entered into by the American student. He believed and she believed that when she went to school and did the right thing and took out that higher education, it was predicated on the incorrect belief that their government was doing the correct thing and creating a sustainable economy such that when they entered the workforce there would be jobs out there. We know, in fact, that that was not the case. Because at the very same time you're incurring hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loan debt, your government and the corporate leaders were using that money that you were incurring to, in turn, shift those jobs offshore and overseas. Now, another important thing to keep in mind is the absolute inescapable economics and mathematics that exists in the student loan environment. I live just near a school, call it that if you will, that teaches students to cut hair. Now, every morning I see these young bright-eyed kids wheeling in their boxes full of hair cutting things and dye and whatever is in those crates that they carry around. But there's literally hundreds of them every single day going into this private school, heaping on top of themselves potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of student loans, so that when they get out 2 years later, they can be certified to cut this mop of hair that's on top of my head. Now, the debt that is incurred by these kids is absolutely unimaginable. No one has ever sat these kids down and said, you know, at the end of this technical program, this education, if you will have student loan debt of $80,000 a year, accruing interest at 5% a year, or whatever the number is. And we need to sit down and talk about the economics of a haircut and understand that for every haircut that you might get $15, or maybe if you're working at some fancy place, $50, you're only going to put in your pocket $25 from that. And understand that you're chasing down this unimaginable interest, that you could cut hair all day long, and your net proceeds from that haircut, that $50 haircut, only end up being $5. No one has ever sat these kids down and explained to them that the interest that's accruing on top of that principal balance for the loan they took out is never going to allow them to pay off, given the proceeds that they get from cutting hair and dyeing hair and doing whatever the heck else it is that's done with hair. So while those that are critical of the people that are in a tough economic situation right now point fingers at those who've incurred this debt, no one understands or recognizes the fact that we, as the adults and the leadership in this country, never sat down these children and explained to them the basic economics that this debt that they were incurring, they were never going to be able to pay off because they were put into a hopeless situation. Now, where I first got involved in the student loan situation was when a very experienced attorney on the corporate side, frankly an attorney that I do battle with, called me up incredulous and in disbelief because her sister had gotten a paycheck seized as a result of student loan. And this very high-powered, very experienced attorney was incredulous at the fact that a paycheck could be seized with no due process. And I likewise, when I first heard about this, was incredulous. But she felt that myself as a consumer warrior would know a little something about this. And as I delved into it, I got to tell you, I was absolutely certain that there was no way that a student's paycheck could be seized without due process. But I was disturbed to find that under the administrative wage garnishment procedures that have been established by the federal government and the corporations that the federal government and our legislators work for, allow these corporations to seize paychecks, to seize the property of Americans, young Americans, with absolutely no due process. And as you dig a little bit deeper into administrative wage garnishment and figure out the way in which these statutes and these procedures were established, the private corporations representing the debt buyers and the debt owners and the corporate finance entities of these primarily private education entities lobbied Congress and created laws and created a regime whereby once they take possession of the debt that's owed by our nation's students and our youth, they then can engage in these very draconian and in fact star chamber proceedings to then go and seize the paycheck of our nation's youth. As an employer, I could get a letter from one of these administrators' wage garnishment proceedings, and if I don't immediately begin seizing my employee's paycheck, I could face penalties. And again, the most disturbing thing about this is that we are incentivizing private corporations to collect this debt and to turn our nation's youth into slaves, and then providing very draconian and strict penalties on the back end of doing it. And we are incentivizing them in the form of the money that they receive for turning our students, our youth, into slaves. Now, you'll hear coming up in the next months and years about the very draconian and very aggressive collection pursuit activities that these corporations engage in. And the thing to keep in mind is that we are creating a very dangerous situation in this country. It's a dangerous situation because you're taking our most vulnerable population and frankly, our most alive population and turning them into very unhappy, disaffected people, and frankly, rightly so. Not just the students on the civilian side, but another important component to keep in mind about this is the corporate vipers lobbying our nation's capital, included within these gross, perverse incentives for financial slavery, provisions whereby they get special incentives for turning our soldiers into debt slaves, so that when our soldiers return from battle and they have access to preferred financial packages to turn them into students afterwards, these private corporations have a special incentive to suck in more and more soldiers and make them students and make them debt slaves, because it balances out the private debt slavery that we're putting the rest of the population into. It's relatively complex, but the bottom line is there are incentives on these private student loan corporations to turn our soldiers into their own debt slaves. But the point to be made from this is this. We are turning a very vulnerable population, a very angry population, into very dangerous and angry people. And frankly, they're correct to be angry. We have the young that are now going to be unemployed and into a hopeless situation. I read a statistic recently that soldiers returning from battle in the 18 to, I believe, 24-year-old age bracket, we're looking at a 30% unemployment. That's a very big problem to have soldiers returning from battle at 30% unemployment. Now, where we are placing them, they're vulnerable at this point in time, and they're being placed into an even more vulnerable position when we're turning them over to these student loan debt slave masters in form of the education system that they're being dumped into. So they're being sold a bill of goods, and our leaders are doing this to them, knowing full well now about the incentives that exist. Now, you'll hear some proposals that are being bantied about reducing down the interest rate that's owed on this $1 trillion worth of debt. But the bottom line is this is not going to chip away at the problem at all, because we're talking about reducing the accrual of the interest from an unimaginable 7% rate down to something 3.8 or whatever. But the bottom line is our nation cannot proceed forward with $1 trillion worth of student loan debt that's put on the backs of our nation's most vulnerable population. This is really problematic going forward. You're going to see this, particularly in the months and years going forward. It's something that has to be addressed, and frankly, the only way to address this is to recognize the wrong that was done at the origination of these loans and to do some kind of debt forgiveness on behalf of our nation's youth and those that have been sold improperly into debt slavery.